Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by picking back up on the slides from where we were last time. So again, I can't reiterate enough how the silhouettes start to change between men and women, where we see that sort of boxiness and the fullness switch from the male figure, the male silhouette, and sort of takes over into the female silhouette. Now, as I had mentioned last time, we're looking at very extreme case. We're looking at the queen. So ultimately, it is going to be different than normal people. But ultimately, as we're going through, we're going to see it does have an impact. Now, we're looking at those really broad silhouettes like the Ditchley portrait, but probably every day tends to feel a little bit in this realm, which means, the Lego mutton sleeves, though full, are not quite as extravagant as we see before. The skirts still have some conical quality to them, but are certainly off the body. And part of the way that works is through something called cartridge pleating, which I mentioned also for the ruffs as well. And when we're done with the slideshow, I'll show you how cartridge pleating works, because it has an impact on both the skirting and those ruffs. So it does have an impact on both men and women. So here we can see the famous Blackfriars portrait. And this really does give you a sense of both men and women in this period. Specifically here in the center, in the canopy, we see the Queen, and we can see Queen Elizabeth's bodice comes down to a very, very, very triangular point. Again, sort of replicating that idea of the codpiece. We see the very full sleeves, very similar to the latter portraits that we saw. And even if we look over here to the side, we can see a number of ladies in waiting wearing a very similar silhouette overall. And we can see the skirt itself is lifted up. And part of the reason that seems shorter is because the catch, that fold right there at the top of the farthingale of that, the plate of that farthingale, has been tucked in to allow for a little bit more room to walk in. So you can see how that skirt could sort of go up and down as needed. But let's take a look at the men in comparison to this. If you notice, their silhouette tends to be very form figured. That's not quite the right term. Following the form of the human body. So that silhouette tends to be, especially through the shoulders to the waist, tends to be very, very classic, meaning following the lines of the body. But then once you hit the waist, all bets are off. Almost anything can happen. And here, generally through these people, we're looking at either pumpkin breeches or a little bit more specific, that term canyon, as the lower parts. Now, we're going to see many slides of this today, so don't panic right now. We'll reiterate them, I promise you. But the idea of pumpkin breeches is the idea that the breeches themselves round out around the hip. And if you notice, what this does is it gives a much more sort of hourglass silhouette that we would traditionally sort of navigate towards, I guess you could say, women. We see a rounded torso and then this rounded body that sort of, feels like larger hips overall. Now, what makes these not just pumpkin breeches, but canyons, is if you look at the bottom, as this meets the leg, you can see that there is an extension that comes down, that extends down onto the leg itself. So, at first shot, we could call those pumpkin breeches, but really we know, because we're smarter, that they are canyons. Up on the torso, we can see doublets, right? So the doublets are the main sort of body piece that's going on. But if we look at the gentleman on the left and the gentleman on the right, left and right. I'm doing it in reverse because, of course, I'm used to doing it in reverse. What we're seeing is something over on top of that. Now, because these are contrasting, meaning the doublets for the guy on the left are white and then the guy on the right is kind of a green color or a black, we can see sort of a contrast piece over it. And that piece is called the jerkin. Now, this isn't sewn into the doublet. This is a separate piece. And I'm going to unshare just for a second to focus on me because, you know, it's all about me. And if you look at what I've chosen to wear today, I'll move back just a little bit, we can see that this, you know, I'm sort of simulating the idea of a jerkin. Now, could this be a sweater? Just going to turn you off there for a second, the mute. Could this be a sweater that has a black body and gray sleeves? Of course it could. I have many sweaters like that. However, we understand this sort of idea in our modern world. We call this a tech vest, right? We know it's made out of fleece and we wear it over we wear it over things. You know, if we think of a vest, when it comes to like suits and such, we tend to think of a jacket on top of that. But in the case of this, we tend to think of this on top of something else. So a jerkin is very similar to this. If we imagine that my goofy sweater here, oh, I'm all untucked now. Don't pull a Giuliani. Then my sweater is the doublet. Then the tech vest or the fleece vest here, that is our jerkin. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I hope it does. Let's get back to the chat. Why isn't the chat showing? Here we go. Excellent. Excellent. So let's go back to those slides. So you can see it is a very similar idea. Now here, it's going to get complicated when we get into the bigger picture of it all. So I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible for you, but know that this can also impact kind of women's clothes as well. When we think about things like the ropa, we'll use this as an example of that. It's not quite a ropa, but if you notice, this kind of has a doublet and jerkin feel to it. So we're seeing some androgyny, not only in silhouette, but also in the way that we layer and put clothes on. Even in this case, where we see a gown, which is kind of ropa-like, we get a sense of that jerkin-like garment with then the doublet underneath it. And so we're starting to see these things shape and mold together. And then we can see also the ruffs up at the neck. So let's get into components of things. So here we see the stay. And for love and money, the craziest thing about this is this was Queen Elizabeth's stay. Now, did she actually wear it? We don't know. But these are called the effigy stays. And they were put on a dress form, a mannequin that looked like Queen Elizabeth that was carried through the streets after her death. And we have the stays in a chemise, I think is all that is left in a wax head, I believe. But this shows what the stays looked like. And you can see that they are very similar to the stays that we saw before. However, if you see all this weird sort of pixelization in here, it's a little hard to see. But each one of these things are bones. Each one of these lines that you see is a bone, a piece of either metal, it could be wood, it could be also baleen, which is whalebone, which isn't actually bone, it's teeth, which is sort of flexible, but anything that is rigid to help keep the body in place. That's why I call it support. It's not necessarily molding the body, but it is moving the body into the correct silhouette. If you notice, there are two straps. So imagine that somebody's laying down in this. Two straps that would come over, and then you can see the front of it lacing across the body. And then if you notice, it has a very, very, very deep basque in the front, and that would push down, in a sense, the belly, keep it sort of, in place so that basque on the bodice would lay nice and smooth down the center front. Now, this is a little bit later of a stay, but a different type from the same period, and this one is from Germany. What makes this one especially interesting is we see that center section, and that's where that wooden strip would go into, that busk, to help keep the front of it very flat. And then you can see all the channels running around the stay to keep it, smooth on the body. And notice that there's a section right up at the bodice area. I don't know if you can see me, but I'm motioning to it, that doesn't have any boning in it. And that's to sort of softly compress the breasts into the proper position. If you look down at the bottom, you can see points or sort of strings hanging down with those little tabs. And what those are garters. So what you would do is put on your hose. Those hose would have a little hole, and then you toggle that little stick, I guess you could say, through it to keep your hose up. Now, if you're reading textbooks, especially older ones, you'll often come across, I'm just going to hang out with my buddy here, my little Elizabethan buddy. You'll often come across pictures like this. And in the old days, people used to say, oh, this is what people wore, these steel or iron corsets, as they called them. But, what we find is that these were just either fetish wear or worn if somebody, say, had scoliosis or some sort of medical condition that required their bodies to be sort of aligned in a very different way. But especially the one that is on the left, that looks, it looks a little bit more fetishy, especially with the brackets in the front. So it probably was not worn by everyday people. But we imagine to some degree that this would be worn over other layers, because you can imagine that metal would ultimately be very dangerous on your body. So this is an exception more than the rule, but often you'll come across images like this as you're going along. And so here is what I would consider to be everyday Elizabethan. We still see those silhouettes in, for the women. We see the fuller sleeves. They're not quite as Lego mutton-y as we saw in Queen Elizabeth. I believe this is Queen Elizabeth as well. But it still is significantly larger than the sleeves we've seen before. Notice that the sleeves are paned, meaning they're made up of individual strips and then tied together at intervals. The bodice comes down into a basque front. From that basque front, we see a belt that is leading all the way down into a pomander of some sort. We see that the skirt is an open gown, giving us an open opening down the front, that overskirt reveals the underskirt. And in this case, that underskirt we call the jupe, right? And we can see very decorative jewels and details on it. We can also see a little bit of a filler inside the neckline. So it almost looks like a man's kamika, right? Coming up into that ruff. One of the last paintings that was ever painted of her was this portrait here. Now, this is inspired by a couple different things. We think of this as a Baroque painting, meaning that it is of the 17th century and not the 16th century. But this is a really fascinating painting for a lot of reasons. The first thing I want you to notice is the bodice of this feels more like a doublet or a jacket than really being a gown. And then on top of this, she has kind of a ropa or a piece of cloth, kind of a mantle, I guess you could say, sort of wrapped around the body. We can see kind of a much more, not costume history romantic, but a much more romantic view of her as opposed to, this big box of costume where her neckline is a bit more open. Everything feels a bit softer. We can see in the back that kind of remembrance of the wings, in this case, sort of being like a big figure 8, but still creating kind of that heart shape down the body. But what makes this painting exceptionally creepy is the embroidery that is on it. So if you notice, first of all, on that sleeve, you can see that it is a snake, and it is, beaded and pearled all the way around. And you can see this little tiny heart pendant that is dangling, sort of from the mouth, which is kind of interesting. But notice on the orange robe that there's also more embroidery. We see the eyes and the ears, and whether or not she actually had an eyes and ears robe, it really is more of a symbol to say that she was the eyes and the ears. She saw everything, she heard everything. And so I find it very kind of macabre and interesting and exciting, and kind of fabulous all at the same time. Now, I don't usually show costumes, okay? Because, once she did smell everything. She probably smelled a little bit herself. But when we look at costumes, like the things that I show you, they're built with the best intentions usually, and the best research, we'd like to think, as possible. But ultimately, they're still manufactured and thought about in the genre of theater, right? They're thought about with, speed and practicality and budget and time and quick change abilities. Well, the Globe, which is in London, does theater in traditional manner. And when they do a traditional manner piece, they do clothing exactly the way that clothes would be built. So here we see, this was just a presentation garment for opening night, I believe, for the person who is playing Queen Elizabeth. But everything was created here in the manner in which it would be. And I believe it was also all hand sewn. There's nothing on this that, was picked up at Joann's for, $1.95. This is real stuff. Now, these are my pictures taken in 2007, I think, and super blurry, I'm sorry. But we can see the components that sort of build up the silhouette that we've understood. And when we look at this close-up picture, you can see that the textiles themselves are embroidered, beaded, detailed. In the back section here, we can see that this is a damask fabric, or a brocade, as we sometimes call it. And then here we can see all of this intricate detailing, which I think is embroidered with all these little tiny pearls put on it. Even the laces and such were done in the manner in which lace would have been at the time. And so they create the garments exactly as they are. And we'll see a few of these costume pieces going through, because we're just on the verge of actually having real clothes that we can kind of look at. When we get to the Cavalier, things start showing up. We'll see a few men's things for Elizabethan, but it's really when we get to the next period, spoiler alert, second semester, that we start to see actual garments available for us to look at. So we'll revisit that in a couple seconds. Here we see a great painting. Okay, that's it, right? Yes, that is it. And we can see, though it is somewhat dark, you can get a sense of how, in this case, we've really androgenized the whole idea of a gown, in a sense, by this upper bodice, which has a contrasting sleeve, which gives the sense of a jerkin over a doublet. Now, is it a jerkin? No, because it's a gown, but it gives the sense of it, which often ends up making it feel, again, very androgynous. We can see the same things, the chain around the waist. Notice here we see the peccadilles, which are, instead of it being a full peplum, can you see that they're made up of little tiny tabs going around the basque front of it all? And we see that very intricate ruff going all the way around. And notice the hair itself, when we looked at Elizabeth, we saw very fancy hair, and this is still pretty fancy, but it's really the hairline that is giving us the sense of that heart. But this looks like a hairstyle almost everyone probably could achieve. Now, when we look at people in the streets, and again, we're still not painting a ton of pastoral scenes and poor people, but we do have a couple illustrations that sort of send us to the place of, common people. And this one I find really exceptional for a couple reasons. First of all, notice this woman right here. We can see that she has on some form of a bodice, but then has pinned her sleeve up to that bodice, allowing us to see the shift underneath it. That upper bodice has, some sort of a kind of phrase-like quality on the edge of it. And then we can see that it laces down here in some sort of either corselet, or this is a scarf that is tucked into some of the lacing. And then we can see an apron on the front. Very simple, very easy. If we look at the woman in the center, get big, there we go. We can see multiple layers happening, some sort of gown over it all, and then a shift inside with that ruffled lace collar. So it's not quite a ruff, but it's more phrase-like going around. And then we see these hats. In this case, we could call it, just a hood. And then and then we see we're sort of veering from women, but look at how cool this outfit is. So you can see it looks like it's made out of red leather, or, a really reddish brown leather. So it would be a doublet in leather, which is kind of great. And then if we look in the background, we can see people as well in a little bit more upper class Elizabethan clothing. And you can see these women out in the streets are wearing veils over their heads, which would be, the way that we would walk around in public with some sort of veil. And we can see some other women back here wearing garments that we've sort of seen: bodices, skirts, ropa, ruffs, and then the veil off the back. Here we see one last one. And this one we get an even better sense of what we're looking at here, where we can see these green sleeves that are attached. But notice this is kind of a piece of cloth, like a shawl, that comes over the bodice and then is pinned down here underneath. So it's kind of like a little shrug or a little jacket, but it doesn't go underneath the arms. It just sort of comes over like a poncho and then pins for shape. Really cool. We can see the shift here, and we can see a little bit of the shift at the neck. We can see that the bodice laces across the front, and then we can see a skirt down here and then an overskirt or an apron on that. And then here on this other woman who's doing some dastardly things to some fowl, we can see more of a jacket, I guess you could say. If we look here, we can see that it has a sort of finale to it. It's worn outside with sort of this ruffled peplum, but a very full sleeve. And then we can see that bit of ruffle at the neck. Look what she's doing to that poor chicken, just ripping its head off, breaking its head. And then in the back here, we see various work people, which kind of makes it interesting as well. Here we see some children. And we can see similar ideas to what we talked about before. Notice it kind of has a jerkin doublet detail to it, but it really is a ropa. That sort of greenish gray piece here is a ropa, but we can see the phrase around the neck. We can see the ropa here as well with that little half sleeve, and then the fit sleeve going on. And if we look here, we can see this young person is wearing a black work shirt, very similar to the shirt that we saw earlier, with then sort of a square neckline of the gown, which is very sort of Tudor. Now, one of my favorite things from this period are, this idea of separates does become popular, especially for at home, not for court, not for things like that. But this is a jacket from the period. And what's really interesting about this is there are 4 or 5 jackets that are very similar in style from this period. They're all made of linen, and they have this very intricate circle embroidery on it that you can see, continues all the way down the body. You can see that there's a bit of gold lace, I guess you could say, that goes around. I would call it trim because it's not quite lace, but it's lace. That goes down up the front as well. It has the shoulder wings that I mentioned before with a little bit of lace on them, and then the sleeves themselves piped down the center. And then it has a little cuff that turns back with that lace, and then you can see the back as well. Now, what's really fun about this right now is Allison and I are working on recreating a similar jacket for a project that I try to contribute to every once in a while. So by next semester, hopefully, we will have a very similar jacket, not with the embroidery, but with the details and the shape. But ready for what makes this super, super cool? Not only do we have the jacket, but we also have a painting of somebody in that jacket, the exact jacket. Now, how do we know it's the exact jacket? It's the placement of the embroidery right here. If you look, there's a star, there's a leaf, there are 3 little things. If we look right here, you can see the star, the leaf, and the 3 little things. The scale may be off ever so slightly, but it is the jacket. We know that the woman who is in this portrait wore that jacket. Now, she's wearing it in a slightly different style, in a style that is actually more Jacobean, meaning the end of the Elizabethan before we get to the Cavalier. But how cool is that? How cool is it that we actually have a garment that is represented in a painting? We're so used to looking at a picture of clothes and then being able to go to the store or go somewhere and purchase it. But here, we actually have the real garment and its existence, in its existence, excuse me. We could see over that jacket, she is wearing a ropa in velvet. And then we can see that she's wearing a ruff as well, but has chosen to, instead of wearing it flat, sort of keep it lightly starched. So it sort of creates an angle from the chin to the shoulder. So I just love that. I think that's really great. A few other things. Here we can see some black work on some garments. The first one is a shift. And if you notice, they really emphasize the upper part because that's what would probably be seen underneath the garment. But then the skirt or the petticoat part of it is just plain. I think that's really just fabulous. But look at that work. I mean, again, I'm using work both as the definition and how much time and energy went into it. Just really beautiful. It almost looks printed. But then also we can see a coif or a cap right here that is done as well in that black work. And in between the black work, it even has a little bit of raised detail in it, giving it so much texture and so much dimension, which makes it really beautiful. Here we can see, again, some Elizabethan with a little bit more roundness to it, not quite as square, but we can start to see as we move into the Jacobean or into the 17th century, 17th century, that the sleeves will start to deflate a little bit. The bodies will start to get a little bit higher. The bodice will start to have a higher waistline and the silhouette will start to get softer, but we're still in that land altogether. And then finally here, we can see an actual ropa a little bit later. And I may have shown this before when we were talking about ropas in the Italian Renaissance, but you can see how that was kind of done. It was on a yoke, and then it just has full body pleats put all the way into it so that it sort of cascades down the body as an at-home robe, I guess you could say. And then underneath the gown or the jacket would appear. Now here we're also seeing the supportas, this garment, I guess you could call it, this accessory that would go underneath the ruff so that it would stand at the appropriate angle. So this could be made out of wire, it could be made out of, this one's textiles, fabric, but it has a wooden armature in it. But something to kit that ruff into that perfect position, that sort of propped element. And that's why we call an underpropper or a supportas, or also a rubato. Hello. Let's go back. And this is ultimately where we go with women's clothes. And we can see in this case, and this is really now hitting the 17th century, we can see those ruffs in certain areas are going to get immense. So this is Flemish. This is a Flemish painting. And you can see how thick that is. It almost looks like an air filter or carburetor on a car, right? So super thick. And we can also tell that this is often Flemish by that shape of the bodice. You notice how it kind of comes down and then flaps out like an apron. And that tends to be a very popular style in the Low Countries. Now, looking a bit at the underwear, we can see here something that we have seen before, but now we're in the Elizabethan territory to really make it make a bit more sense. So here we can see that idea of the bum roll going all the way around, which would help to keep a sort of horizontal nature to the skirt and then fall down, especially if you weren't wearing a full farthingale. And if you look back here on that little nail in the back, you can see it in a much sort of more donut or bagel form. But this is what we sort of use as the basis for that drum farthingale. Now, it could have, again, a series of rings that extends from it. But the most important thing when we're really trying to get that perpendicular tabletop is this sort of plate. And it almost looks like a tutu, right? It looks like something jetting from the body that we kind of understand. But what this would be made with is basically a wagon wheel, a series of rings with then vertical supports on it to keep it nice and flat. And if you notice, it dips down a little bit in the front and it tips up a little bit in the back. So having a bum roll under that would really help keep it in place, much like the underpropper, the supportas. But it would really create much more of a perpendicular skirt, creating something that feels much more like a drum or rigid. But that upper piece is really the most important. And when we see it underneath a skirt, you can see how that would create a much more visual jet off the body. And here we are at that Elizabethan dress. And we can see that the skirt, here as we look at it at the front, actually, I can move the actual picture. We can see that special little fold as well. Can you see how this is folded under? It's not a separate jacket with like a peplum, a ruffled peplum. More than likely, it's tucked underneath to allow for that skirt to hang just at the right level. So again, I use the globe as primary research because it is as close to the real thing as one could possibly ever find. And here we see undergarments, we see a blackwork shift, we see the stay, and notice again how that really flattens out the whole front of the body. We can see the bum roll, which would support the skirt. And if you notice the little pink ties, you know, those are holding on either the bum roll or in this case, we can also see that they're holding on to tabs and holding on to the farthingale. Because you have to imagine, once you put these pieces on, there's so many layers. You need to connect them all because you can't get to them. If your petticoat, your farthingale starts to fall down, you know, you can't reach up and find the right place to do it. So often everything would need to be tied together so you knew that it was secure. Here we see again that supportas, the one up, the drawing, the illustration, shows it more of a frame, but the one that is on the dress form is more of a padded and textiled sort of event that is putting everything in place. I've got to turn off the heat for a second. Hold on. It's actually not heat. It is, go off. Air conditioning blowing right at me, which is lovely on the coldest day so far. So you can see how that would push or prop the ruff in the appropriate manner. So here we can see some ruffs, and each one is made ever so slightly differently. Up here, we can see some that have been starched into place in that sort of figure 8 silhouette. These little ties would tie at the back to hold it in place. And the one that is down here, down in the lower corner, that one is unstarched, meaning that's what it would look like when you washed it. So how would you get it all the way to the other one? Well, you would use this sort of stick, which is basically like a curling iron that we might see today. So it's kind of a poker. What you would do is you would put it in the heat, and then when your rough was still wet, you would very carefully go in and sort of steam it, or much like you might do with a curling iron, sort of round each of those areas to create that figure 8. And ultimately, once it was starched and pressed, then come on, expand. My hands are a little sweaty right now, I guess. Then it would be put into this position, right? And then to keep it in that position, here they've used little stitches, which is fine, but really what they would often do is put pins in there, straight pins. Why straight pins? Well, because you would take them out, then you would have a piece of cloth that could be washed and restarched and would end up looking like this, so that then you could go back in. And it's a lot of work. It's a super lot of work, but it makes for a really fascinating time. Okay. So here we are at men's clothes. And this is one of my I know I say this all the time, folks. I'm sorry. I love this painting. I love this painting so much. This painting is a tailor. And so we have to assume that he is wearing some of his best clothes. And we can see his doublet with a peplum and a belt around that peplum. And then from there, what are we seeing? Pumpkin breeches. Notice how round and how shaped these are. And we can see that they're made up of paints, individual strips that allow us, when they move, if you look really closely, come on, we can see a bit of the lining through there. So you can imagine, as one walks, these would have a lot of definition and a lot of kind of activity to them. If we notice right there, we can see a little bit of the codpiece popping out, but really codpieces are going to start to shrink a bit in this period. We can see that he has more of a phrase than a full-on ruff, but we're starting to see it jet out from that doublet. We can see a tiny bit of the shoulder wing right here, and then we can see the sleeve. Now, notice that that sleeve is kind of cut, bent. It's sort of bent in an L, right? Because you would want to be able to have as fit of a sleeve as possible, but create that little sort of nest for your elbow when you bent your arm completely. And then we can see that it has tiny, tiny, tiny little cuts all over it. Now, this is a very similar doublet, but it's not that doublet. But we can see how that would actually go on the body. See how it follows all of the lines? No, emphasis really on the shoulders, creating this big, broad silhouette. It really ends up being a very classic silhouette. And notice that sleeve. Notice how that's cut. You can see that little elbow pocket in those sleeves, right? And then throughout the body, you can see all these tiny little clips that were put in there. And then notice the buttons and buttonholes. We don't have the buttons, but we can see where they would all go. All those very intricate buttons and buttonholes all the way down. And if you look at the peplum, zoom in a little bit, you can also see that there are little holes or eyelets all the way around the peplum to allow you to tie on the various pieces that would be going along with it. Okay. Now, this is a little challenging because when we look at this, we could be looking at two different things. We've already looked at female clothes that had a bodice with a tie-on sleeve. And throughout history, we have seen, doublets or jackets, torso coverings that had contrasting sleeves. But for this class and for art as you're going forward, when we see in Elizabethan, excuse me, a torso that contrasts the sleeve for men, we're going to assume that it is a jerkin over a doublet. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Jordan. But in truth, this could be a doublet with contrast sleeves. But the problem is I can't crawl into this painting, right? And then, ask him, can you take off that overlayer to see if this is really what it is? So we're always going to guess that if we see it contrasting, it's a jerkin over a doublet. Also, even in this case, this could actually be a doublet with a matching jerkin on top of it, but we can't tell. I can't get my hand in there. I can't see any, definition. So we're going to look at this because the body and the sleeve match, that is actually a doublet all in one. Now, jerkins can be all sorts of interesting things. And this is one from the British Museum, or the London Museum, that is made out of leather. And I used to have a replica of this, and for some reason, and this is my life, it disappeared. But this is the real one here. And then this is one, and you can probably see it a little bit. This was one that you could actually touch. It was made out of leather, but you can see it has all these tiny little punch marks in it of stars. Really, really beautiful. So this one made out of leather that could be worn over a doublet. Here we see, and these are Jacobean as well. They're a little bit later, but we can see two matching combinations of clothes where we see a doublet, and this could be a doublet and a jerkin, right? It could be two pieces, but we don't know since they're the same, with, in this case, a pair of paned pumpkin breeches, right? Very round. And then if we look at this person, little hard to see. We'll see it a little bit better over on this side, but you can see that he is wearing a doublet and then a pair of Venetians. Now, what make Venetians Venetians? And we're going to see more pictures, I promise you. But they're full at the top and then taper to the knee. But when we look at this close up, you can see that this is all slashed and punched. Even the tabs here are punched. And those are just cuts directly in the textile. And if you get to it close up, you can see that it's all shredded. It's absolutely just shredded. They wouldn't put anything on it, like freight check or anything. And then here, you can see all the hundreds of buttons that run up the front of it. Really incredible. Here is an actual doublet from the period. And you can see that it even has a basque front on it, giving it a little bit of depth in there. And we can also see that the sleeves are cut in that position, that L position. Notice that doublet has a very high neck as well. But the reason I show this, notice that the pattern doesn't match. It's just wonky. It's just off. Even if you look at the front of it, you can see that the peplum doesn't quite match. And this makes me a little happy for a couple reasons, because I spend so much of my life trying to match patterns and trying to make it perfect. And yet the real things that we have aren't perfect. And it makes me realize that it was human, right? We get clothes from factories where everything is perfectly matched and perfectly dealt with. And so we don't notice it. And this sort of shows humanity, right? Somebody putting something together. Here's another great one. Now, this is a specialty doublet. This is a fencing doublet. And so you can see, first of all, it has that sort of rounded stomach, that peas cod of the stomach. But notice that it's padded as well. And that would protect you when you were fencing, when you were out doing, manly fighting games, and make sure to protect you, from sport. Now, again, this wouldn't be worn as armor. This would be for matches and practice and such, but it wouldn't be actual armor. But this is real, and this is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, this one always gets a laugh, and I kind of understand it, but it is a really beautiful painting. We see this young person, right, all lounging out in the world, and we can see some romanticism there. Notice the doublet and the doublet sleeve, probably the same, but notice when we were talking in class about that idea of changeable silk, we get a sense of something that has much more of a texture to it than we normally would see. And then here we're seeing probably Venetians. Can you see how these are full but sort of tapered down to the knee? And in this case, because he's outside, we also see boots. Gotta love the boots. But in most cases, when we're looking at these, we're seeing shoes. We're seeing hose and shoes. We know we like a good boot. It's very swashbuckly and such. But more often than not, we're seeing shoes. And here we're seeing very clearly a jerkin in that beautiful embroidery over a doublet in that cream. And then we see the Venetians full at the top and then tapering to the knee. We can also see the sort of overcoat of the period, which was the cape. The cape was the most popular sort of thing. So if we're thinking about the layers that would go on, especially on our torso, we'd first put on our kamika, then we would put on our doublet, then we would put on our jerkin, then we would put on a cape. And then we would pick the breeches that would most interest us. Now, notice also, too, this gentleman has decided not to wear a ruff, but started to wear what we call the plate ruff. If you notice, it has the same sort of spread from the body, but it's thin, it's flat. Sometimes it would have pleats in it, but it would be pressed thin. And when we see pictures of Shakespeare, we often see him in a plate ruff. It still has the sort of jetting off the body, but it doesn't have the dimension of a traditional ruff. Here we can see two people, and this is really swell. We see a father and a son. And the father, we can see a white doublet. We can see the orange jerkin. We can see breeches, which if we just look at the upper part, the upper section of the breeches, we could call those pumpkin breeches. But if we notice, we have an extension down below where these would officially be called cannons. Now on the young guy here, we would call this a doublet, even though this may be a jerkin and a doublet in the same textile. We're going to call this a doublet. And then he's wearing what we call slops. So they're fullish here, but really where's the most of the fullness? Down here at the bottom. So the Venetians are full at the top and tapered to the bottom. These are sort of tapered at the top and fuller at the bottom. And then we can also see the shoes that were so popular. So here we see the lower stocks, the stocking, we could say. And notice that these are paned. Both of the breeches are paned, made up of strips of textile. Here we could see a very severe sort of silhouette, right? But notice that there's this large slash in it and then tons of buttons and lots of ribbon work. Very, very fancy. Here we see a full set of clothing with a bodice and pumpkin breeches or cannons, because they do have this extension off of them. And notice that these are slashed all around. And then it has peccadilles instead of a peplum. They're made up of individual tabs. Now, this is painted much later, or it's an illustration from much later, I believe. Do I have a date on it? But I found this as I was at RISD for an exhibit on engraving. And when I saw this, I almost freaked out. I almost pooped myself. I was so excited because what was great about this is because these guys are fighting and tumbling and falling over each other, we can see all these layers in a way that we might not see them otherwise, because everybody in these portraits, right, all buckled up, all tight. So look at this guy in the center. You know, we could see his doublet, but we can also see his kamika. And then when we come down, we can see his breeches. Now, then down here, we can see his stocks, which have ripped. And these breeches here, there is a puppy. Yes, hello, puppy. But he looks a little scary, so we're not going to focus too much on him. But, you know, these breeches probably would be on a drawstring or tied so that they would stay close to the knee. But because they're fighting, you know, they've been left open. Whoop, sorry. Here, we see a gentleman with a doublet with tied-on sleeves, allowing us to see the bit of the kamika underneath. We can see it's belted, but then we can see the points right back here that should be tied to the doublet, but it's not. They're starting to sag, allowing us to see the bit of the kamika in back. And then this guy, come on, get bigger. There we go. And then this guy, hey, we could see his doublet has 2 slashes down the center back. And then we can see the kamika, and then his drawers are starting to get a little droopy there. And we can see the belt around holding everything in place. So we get to see all sorts of layers that we might not normally see. And there's a bit of a better illustration a little bit closer up so you can see those details. Really fascinating. You can see the ties. You can see how it opens. Beautiful. And then within this, there are going to be, you know, the people who take fashion just a little bit too far. So here we see a gentleman in a pair of pumpkin breeches, but notice he's pulled his, the lining of the pumpkin breeches that are paned out to kind of create all this sort of fluff around it. And then to make it even weirder, if that wasn't weird enough, his cod piece kind of mimics that, right? It sort of has slashes in it, and then it has this big sort of bow on it. And every time I look at this, it looks like those things that they carry bags around for dogs, you know, those little poop bags. I don't know why, it's just crazy. Or check out this. This is a lot of look, right? We see the pumpkin breeches, we see the stripes of the panes in the sun and moon detail, then the lining behind it is orange with diagonal. The doublet, very bodice-like in a lot of ways, but in that sort of silvery color. We can see the plate ruff, and then we can see the hose. And again, we had mentioned this before, but those stocks or the hose, often we would start to put little details on them. These, and when we embroider on them, we call it clocking. And notice his shoes, like a Mary Jane we might see today, with a little tiny heel, and then this big pom-pom on the front of it. We can see a big chunk here. And then to show that he's totally butch, over here in the corner, we can see his armor, which again is not armor to actually fight in. It was probably more armor for a celebration or such. And then here we can see that he has one other piece of armor underneath his plate ruff that is probably helping to support it as well, acting like a support toss. Even here on this doublet, we can see some interesting elements. I mean, this one has false sleeves, so it could be a jerkin with false sleeves, but then notice it has this really cool asymmetrical opening on it, and then, you know, full on pumpkin breeches there. Okay, one last thing I want to show you. We saw these shirts before with the black work on them, but I also want to talk about this idea of gloves. And when we see a glove that has an extension on it, that extension we call a gauntlet. And that gauntlet helps protect the sleeve itself, right? So it comes in. Now, if you remember, a lot of the sleeves had wrist ruffs at the ends, right? Perpendicular things. Well, what will happen is as gauntlets start to become popular, those will start to go away and we'll start to see less roughs at the wrist and more gauntlet style cuffs. Notice how this is a gauntlet style cuff right there. You can imagine if I put on a gauntlet glove, it would just smooth right over that and protect that white from the cuff. Okay? So folks, that's the slides. Those are the slides for the Elizabethan. Now, what I want to do is show you a few little details of the period. So if you make me sort of your center screen, if I'm not already your center screen, then you'll be able to see these items in detail. So the first thing I want to talk about is that idea of ruffs and cartridge pleating. So here we can see, hopefully you can see pretty well, a ruff. And you can see that it is relatively thin. Let's get it a little, yeah, you can see it's relatively thin, but it is sewn into very small sort of figure eights onto the band of it to sort of jettison it out. That is what cartridge pleats do. It sort of creates a perpendicular cantilevered quality. I keep moving it away from the camera, I'm sorry. A cantilever quality to keep it into this sort of thickness. And this can be done in many different ways. Here's another one that you can see has much more thickness, and because it has the trim on it, it gives you a little bit more of a sense of the dimension on it. And once these were put into position, then they would be pinned. Now, in theater, we sort of use a chaser thread or a little thread that goes through it. But you can see how much dimension that would give. And those cartridge pleats, specifically cartridge pleats like this, you could imagine also being on a skirt or on a sleeve or something, right? Packing as much textile into that, but allowing it to cantilever over, to jet from the body and then drop. So now let's take a look at a few of the gentlemen's garments. And unfortunately, somebody has altered these, so they're not quite what I originally wanted. Do I need that anymore? Okay, so I'm going to unplug. Hopefully it won't screw anything up since I'm not sharing the screen. Groovy, groovy. And what we're looking at here, let's get down there. What we're looking at here is a series of garments, matching garments. And so what would we call this? Just based on what we see here. Anybody have guesses?
My senior prom outfit?
It's not your senior prom outfit. What are we looking at? What are these pieces? So let's get a little closer look. I'm going to move in just a little bit so we can see the torso there. And then here, we can see the sleeve. And then down here, we can see the breeches. And we can see that they're made up of strips. So what would this piece be? What are we looking at here? Well, yes, they are sleeves, but what garment, based on what we looked at from illustrations in art, what does this sort of inform us? Come on, all. Not a peplum.
The jerkin.
Okay, so this part, we can see what appears to be a jerkin, right? Because it's in contrasting textile. Then the sleeve would be the sleeve from the
doublet.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And then down here, we're looking at pumpkin breeches. right? Can you see the panes? We can see that they're made up of individual strips, and then underneath, we can see the lining. Now, this is where costumes are lies, because what this actually is, because we can get in there, we can really look at what this is because it's here in front of us. Even though it appears we don't have a dress form that is small enough for this. But if we look at this, it actually is a doublet with contrast sleeves. So it gives the appearance, it gives the appearance of a jerkin over a doublet, but really it's just a doublet because it's all in one piece. And then down here, as we can see, the pumpkin breeches, I'll just leave those on. We can see the pumpkin breeches. Now, this is a real, not real, but you know, I'm not going to try to trick you in this one, and you'll see me dress him. This one will probably be too small too, even though this is one of the smallest dress forms I have. All the men in this show were wee, so tiny. But, oh, okay. We'll get at least a couple buttons buttoned, right? Not many, but a couple. So in this case, what are we looking at here? We know it's a single garment with sleeves, so we know that this is the a
Doublet.
right? And then what am I going to put onto it?
Jerkin.
A jerkin.
Right. And so then that jerkin goes over on top of it. So see, this looks very similar to the other one, but because we can see the actual pieces, then we can see how it breaks down. Okay? And then this one has a phrase on it, something a little bit softer that would sort of plate out a little differently. So that gives you a sense of how those pieces work. And like I said, for research, for conversation, for those things, think about it in terms of if the sleeves and the body match, we're going to call it a doublet. If this part is contrasting, then it's a jerkin over a doublet. These all have peplum. They don't have peccadilles. Thought I had one. I brought one that had peccadilles. I don't. I'm a loser. Okay. But you can see, I'm going to show you one more thing. You can see as we get closer that sort of idea of even internally, you would often see things like ribboning and then what appear to be slashes in it, but this is really just the detail of the textile as well, but giving it that sort of style that we saw in some of those illustrations. I know, I'm disappointed in me too. Okay. Do they ever attach the sleeves to a contrasting bodice, or is that just a functional? No, they would. They would often do that, but when it comes to art, unless you very distinctly see that tie-on thing, it's almost impossible to tell whether it's a bodice and a skirt, or excuse me, a bodice and separated sleeves, or that it is, you know, a jerkin over a doublet or contrasting sleeves. It's hard, and that's what makes, you know, our world hard, because if you know to do that, you can make anything kind of look like anything in that world, right? You want to look like you have more wealth, but you don't have enough textile. Well, you could make it look like you're wearing a doublet and jerkin, but really it's just a doublet with contrasting sleeves.
I actually have a jacket like that, with like a vest that comes with like a sweatshirt, and people always think it's like two things, but it's like they're surprised
Right.
when I take it off and it's just one.
Right. Or sometimes you'll even see it's not quite the same thing, but if you think about Clueless, I don't know if any of you remember the movie Clueless. If you haven't watched it, you have to. But Cher in it is often wearing like a short sweater vest with then a long white shirt underneath it. And probably what she's wearing are two separate pieces. But at the time when they came out, they would sew a shirt into a sweater vest, and they would also sew the bottom of it, to the sweater vest. So when you would take it off, it would be all one piece. And there are a couple other things. Sometimes you'll see shirts with or sweaters with kind of like a faux shirt inside of them. It's kind of weird, but still very useful. It looks like you have two layers, but it's really only one. Okay.
Historically, is this like where that came from? The idea of just like sewing them together?
I mean, sort of. For us, it tends to probably be just easier manufacture. And for one thing, you get the look of two. But yeah, certainly we can see it throughout history that we're trying to make things look different than what they possibly really are. Okay. So we will see each other on Thursday from the comfort of our homes. I'm actually going to be home on Thursday, which is going to be weird. I hate teaching at home, but that's where my life is now. So if you have any questions, please keep those in mind. Look at the Brightspace page. Sometimes I get a couple questions about things that I know are very clear on the Brightspace page. So check that out. Make sure that you look at all the details of the things that you need to do for the grades. And otherwise, I will see you on Thursday. And then, as I said, Monday, we will, we're just going to use that as a work day for you all. So if you have questions, I'll be around my email and such then. Okay?